Okay, hello guys, and welcome to today's stream. I hope that everything is okay on the technical front. I think I had some very mild issues with my microphone just before going live. So please, guys, let me know if everything is okay on your end. Hello, by the way, to Kusi and to Deyu, to Johan, to Saket. What's up, guys? So somebody is saying, Deyu is saying that it's okay. We're gonna look for a second confirmation, and and we've got it from Kusi. So everyone says audio and video is good. That's what we want to hear. So we can dive into the chess. Well, first of all, what exactly is this? You guys might have seen the title. It's called Bootcamp Preview on Calculation and Decision Making. So as you can see over there at the bottom, there's a logo says coachess.com. So I'm one of the coaches over at coachess.com, which is the first ever dedicated all-in-one coaching platform. So if you guys are thinking of doing some coaching, or perhaps you are a coach, this is a cool platform to check out. And recently we've introduced an initiative of boot camps, and the next boot camp that's coming up at the end of October is my own, and the topic is calculation and decision making. So I wanted to sort of discuss these two intersecting topics. It's going to be a little bit different to a boot camp, because a boot camp is like 10 hours, a lot of interaction. Everyone's on the same call. So it's a little bit different. There'll be less interaction, but I will ask questions as I go along and hopefully give you guys some good tips. Hello, by the way, to Sombrero. Good to see you too. So first things first, let's talk about some of the common mistakes in calculation. So, before we do that, before I actually take you guys to a little sheet with some of these common mistakes, I'd like everyone to warm up by solving one position here on the board. So the question is not too difficult. The question is, can White win a piece from this position? Can he force the win of a piece from this position? Yes or no? And please tell me why. Okay, so Fluffy Giant says yes, and Umbra seems to agree. He says f4. Okay. Are there any skeptics in the chat, or is everyone agreeing that we can win a piece here? Hello, Maripant. It's good to see you. Maripant, you've just joined the fray, but perhaps you can answer this question. The question is White able to win a piece here? Yes or no? So Hadi says no. He's the first person saying no. Why is that, Hadi? Or anybody else? Yes, Nizai with the right answer. The problem for White is that after f4, Black drops the bishop back and he goes e5 and he gets in the fork. But in fact, the tactic doesn't work, because in this instance, you've got bishop c5 check, and the problem is against your king. And this is a quite simple exercise, but you'd be surprised at how many people, they are just so caught up in the idea that White has, which is to fork two pieces, that they don't stop to consider the resources of the opponent. And so with that quick example to one side, let's go and show the points we're going to be talking about today. So here we are. And yeah, I've already said this is a bootcamp preview, so we'll move on. But here is one of the slides that I want to sort of focus on. These are considered to be some of the most common mistakes, or the most common mistakes by a top trainer from India, RB Ramesh, and he listed these within his top 5 mistakes. These are 4 of them, and I couldn't agree more. So the first one is poor visualization. People are unable to picture the position in their mind. And then everything gets blurry, everything gets hazy, and then it's like, well, you're sort of wandering around a forest and you're completely blind and nothing to do. The second one is, I think, the most common one in my experience as a coach, and that's unstructured thinking process. For me, that will be a big part of the focus of the camp. Trying to get students to just think in a more systematic way. Because most people are just thinking sort of chaotically. They're going from one variation to another variation to another variation without any particular order. So for that, we have a system, general advice of going from forcing to least forcing. I'll explain what CNC means, and I'll explain what pawn breaks means in a second. Now, the third one is not paying enough attention to opponent ideas. And actually, this example here that we just looked at on the board, right here, we can see that falls under that category. You're not paying enough attention to the opponent idea of this possible check on c5, saving his piece. Finally, the last one, going too quickly into the analysis of complicated lines and then getting stuck. That's links a little bit with that unstructured thinking process as well. So these 2 points are linked. But of course, listing the mistakes is just one thing. How can we actually avoid them? So these are the general bits of advice that should be practiced as part of the training process. So the first one, visualization. The biggest sin that my students make, and the students, I mean, not just mine, but students in general, in my experience, is that they're not disciplined enough at solving positions without moving the pieces. So if you guys can relate to that, sometimes you've got a difficult puzzle and you're just like, I don't see things clearly. Let me just move the pieces so I see things clearly. The biggest piece of advice there is it's better to solve easier puzzles, but just never move the pieces. Because, nobody is going to let you move the pieces in a tournament game. And the whole idea behind training is to simulate the conditions that you're going to have in a tournament game. So that's a big one there. Not moving the pieces is a habit to try and kill off. The second one, on unstructured thinking, it's a little bit tedious, but the advice there is consciously, when you're analyzing, because you can't do this during a game, you might not have enough time, but when you're solving puzzles at home, or when you're analyzing a game of yours, try and actually make a conscious effort of listing out all the moves when you're analyzing. On top of that, you can also, in slower time control games, you can do that on your opponent's time. So you can consciously scan the whole board. And we'll talk about the scanning method here, but also what all of this means, this CNC, CTPB. And what that actually is you're listing the moves according to a particular structure, which is checks and captures first, then checks. That's the CNC is checks and captures, then checks, then captures. I forgot a C. Then captures, then you move to the threats, and then finally within threats you even include a type of active move, or not within threats, but around that point, which is pawn breaks. Many people are not so much focused on pawn breaks, but they're oftentimes that'll be the move in the position. So we'll revisit this. And then not paying enough attention to the opponent ideas. One of the things that I've noticed with students is that sometimes if they want to try and find what their opponent might do, they flip the board. And then, the problem is you're always kind of training the part of you that sees it from your perspective. So the key is solve puzzles, focusing on the opponent's perspective. Feel free to solve positions or look at positions that you might have, let's say from the white side. You can look at them from the black side to sort of, to train yourself. You should be able to solve tactics both when you have the pieces, let's say white to win in a position. Let me make it more clear. Let's say if I give you this position right here, I should be able, you should be almost as comfortable solving it from the white side as from the black side, or from the black side as from the white side. It should not matter. And that's something that you can train. Whereas if you're constantly saying, if I say to you here, white to play has a great move, or black to play has a great move, and depending on whether I tell you it's white to play or black, the first thing you do is you flip the board to see it from the perspective that is more comfortable for you. That is a bad habit. So besides this, the very last point that I wanted to say is going in too quickly into crazy variations. A lot of the time when that happens, it's actually because you're getting a bit emotional about the position and you suddenly get caught up in one thing. So sometimes that goes back to structuring your thinking, consciously listing out your moves, and sort of just avoiding getting that pull into some particular variation that catches your fancy for whatever reason. So that's the slides there in terms of calculation. And there's one very final slide that I'd like to show you, and that is on general decision-making tips. So some very quick ones, and we'll sort of revisit them in the examples. Stability is your friend. Basically what that means is if you have pieces or pawns or squares that are very badly defended or just completely undefended, they can, and more often than not, they will be used against you. Linked to that, be aware of the general weaknesses or vulnerabilities in your position. And that can be things like your piece coordination, your king safety, just general, anything that has to do with the harmony of your position. Another general decision-making tip, if your opponent has better placed pieces, don't open up the position. Like 9 times out of 10, it's a bad idea to open up the position, and we'll see an example of that. And the final one is maybe the trickiest. If you are calculating a variation and you see that your position has improved, maybe they're, suddenly their pieces are worse coordinated. So your position has improved, but you don't see a killer blow. A lot of the time, if your position has improved, you should keep on investigating. Even maybe all there is a slow move. But when you get positional gains, it's a good idea to not throw them away too quickly. I find a lot of students, they're trying to find a solution to a problem, and they make a lot of positional gains in their position, right? They for example, they weaken the opponent's king, they force a piece out of the game. They do all of these things, but they don't see a killer blow, and so they just throw all of their analysis into the bin, and that's oftentimes a bad idea. So that's it as far as these slides go. Let me take us back into the chess itself. Okay. All right. So the first position that I will show you guys, I had made a note. Okay, now the next position is going to be a little bit trickier. It's going to be a little bit trickier, but it is here. Okay, and I'm actually gonna go ahead and flip the board. And for you guys in the chat, once again, so black to play. Feel free to, I'll give you guys a minute. Feel free to try and come up with a solution. Black to play has a very good position. We see material is equal, but it's his turn, and you can see his development is much better. And on top of that, you can see that he's got some serious threats here with discovered checks. So I will wait, and hopefully somebody will suggest what they would play, some short variation that they would play. So hello to my name is Legion. Thank you, by the way, Raphael on YouTube. I'm keeping an eye, by the way, on the Twitch chat and on the YouTube chat. Hadi Putra says, honestly, I don't play chess in about 5 months because there's no tournaments and friends to play with. I think that's why my calculation is bad. Yeah, for sure. I mean, playing is, and over the board is essential to keeping your calculation skills strong. But I think with a lot of exercise, puzzle solving, and being sort of disciplined, you can actually work a lot on calculation, even away from the tournament scene. So my name is Legion says, are we doing a puzzle or a game analysis? So this is actually a puzzle here. What we're trying to figure out is how black would play. And I gave a little bit of time, and we're getting a few different answers here, but Tweedledee, I'm going to address his answer. He's actually just said that he can win the f4 pawn with knight d3 check. But I'm not so sure about that. Knight d3, check king h1, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, and bishop e3 and castle. Okay, so this is a very interesting variation. So Tweedledee is saying, I can go knight d3 check. Let me actually play those moves. I can go knight d3 check, king h1. I can then go knight takes c1, rook takes c1, and I can go bishop e3 and win the pawn. But, well, something was missed here. Perhaps Tweedledee was considering this variation and now considering the move rook d1 to try and sidestep the pin and defend the knight. And he was thinking Queenside Castle. I think this is the line that he was suggesting. Now, let's say white moves his knight. Black would take the rook, and in the end, capture this pawn on f4. So Tweedledee is confirming that this is the variation he looked at. Well, it's a really impressive bit of calculation and visualizing from move 15 all the way up to move 20. But as he says in the chat, now he's noticing one important detail. The f7 pawn might drop after rook f1. And so it's very easy. This is one of the important things when making calculations and deciding on which path to go down. Very, very easy to get things wrong when you're calculating 4, 5, 6, 7 moves deep. The further you go into your calculations, the more likely you're going to miss some detail. Here, rook f1 was missed. And actually, we will go a little bit further and say that white's best move here was rook c2. Another easy move to miss. So now if you go ahead and you Queenside Castle, then white can just move the knight. And the difference is there is no rook on d1, so there's no rook takes d1, rook takes d1, bishop takes f4 variation. So this solves the problems. And by the way, the variations can continue and get so messy here. For example, maybe black is calculating all of this and sees bishop takes f4. And he says, well, now if rook takes f4, rook d1 check. And I have checkmate, so now I'm happy and I go for this whole variation. But chess is not that simple. Then comes g3, hitting the bishop. And when you move the bishop, now white can take the pawn after all. So we see how the variations get very crazy and very complicated. And suddenly it's very common, you're kind of caught up in this entire tree and you're trying to make this work, but you're forgetting to go back, take a step back and see, was your thought process, could your thought process have been improved earlier on? And that actually takes me to the second, the first variation that Tweedledee suggested. So he suggested the move knight g4 check, king goes to h1, and now knight to e3. And one of the most important things to be good at calculating is having good pattern recognition, spotting different things like the way two pieces link up. In this case, what Tweedledee saw is if rook e1, now black has the move knight c2. and he noticed the 2 rooks are caught and game over. And I suspect he also saw that if white goes rook g1, then knight c2 is a double attack. So this really, in the early days of your calculation, pattern recognition is going to be the name of the game. But the most instructive thing about this whole variation is that after the move knight e3, what bothered, I don't know why I can't make the move, sorry. What bothered Tweedledee was this move rook f3. And so he said after rook f3, he just said, I don't know if I have that. Yeah, he said, darn, rook f3. And then he saw, well, I'm not winning any material. And so he moved on to the other variation about knight d3 and knight takes f4. But this fits into the point that I was making about, let me see if I can pull up that slide. So the variation, the one here, the last point. If a variation gives you positional improvements, be keen to look into the line further, even if you don't see a killer blow. A slow move may be enough. So in this position, can anybody tell me why has black achieved positional improvements? What has black managed? What has black forced white to do that white isn't happy about? Oh, sorry, yes. Show position again, please, says Maripant. Yes, my Maripant, you see, the thing about it is I was testing your visualization. You gotta recall the position. I'm just kidding, of course. But solving blindfold is definitely a good piece of advice. You can start with really simple positions, like very few pieces on the board, endgame positions, some pawn positions, and then you work your way up progressively. Hello to Fionketa. It's good to have you here. MSU says white's pieces are locked up. My name is Legion comments correct. Rook is not defending the back rank, and the queen side can't develop if black gets the rook on the d file. Absolutely. And MSU says I will now play Queenside Castle. Correct. And I think Tweedledee anticipated this. Indeed. So this is a common mistake. Do not stop your calculation here just because you don't see an obvious killer blow. And in fact, Queenside Castle, among other moves, is just a completely winning position because, as the chat pointed out, this knight cannot move. If you move the knight, you're getting checkmated. That's the first detail, the weak back rank. And the reason why the back rank is so weak is because your variation, knight check, pushed his king to the corner, and then knight e3 forced his rook to leave the back rank. So those two things were the positional achievements, and then you can just keep going with a slow move like Queenside Castle. Okay, so hopefully that was an instructive position and relatively clear, and that is actually the solution there. So let me move on to number 3. Okay. So we are going to talk about where is the position? Sometimes it can be a bit tricky, the move order of these positions. Here we go. Or not the move order, the layout of the positions. Okay, so black to play. What would you play? So once again, guys, anyone in the chat who wants to think about this position, I'll give another 45 seconds or so. Yeah, I just managed to, I had done so well I have this this white hoodie, and white top. I've done so well to avoid any stains on it since I got it a few weeks ago. But now I had the smart idea of drinking coffee while having this this hoodie or this top on my lap, and now the top has a bunch of coffee stains. Okay, so we're getting a lot of different moves here. By the way, somebody says, is the title wrong? What do you mean? The title should be Bootcamp Preview, Calculation and Decision Making. Please, guys, let me know if that isn't the case. So, in the meantime, I'm reading a bunch of the moves. I'm not going to call it out. I really appreciate everyone is actually, a lot of people are chiming in trying to solve this one. So appreciate that. So we're seeing a lot of moves. Bishop c4, e5, rook takes c3, bishop c4, e5, rook takes c3. What else do we have? Oh goodness. Huh. Why does it say that stream title? So on YouTube it links correctly. So people are telling me that that's the title on Twitch. That is really very bad, and I will try to correct that. My apologies for that, because I'm not trying to clickbait any people into believing that that I am both Judith Polgar and Vladimir Kramnik combined. I have, as interesting as such a combination would be, I'm not at the point where I'm quite crazy enough to claim such things. So sorry about that. I've changed it. Please let me know now if it's correct. Okay, so it was correct earlier and fine again now, and it fixed. Thank you guys for letting me know, and simultaneously foiling my plan to clickbait people. Okay, so a lot of different options here. A lot of different options. But most people are thinking of the move rook takes c3, it seems to me. And also the idea of e5 or f4. Okay, so let's talk about this position. When we've got a position where we've got a lot of different moves, we need to think systematically. So we think first in terms of checks and captures. And we should look at a move where we can actually play both a check and a capture. And the only one here is bishop takes e3. But after rook takes e3, we're just down a piece. So there isn't much to be done there. So we scrap that. Then we should look at checks individually. There are none besides that one. Captures. Definitely capturing this pawn on c3 looks interesting. And that is about it. So we've got that capture. And finally, we look at threats. And threats include, what I like to look at is both threats and pawn breaks. So in this case, we've got this pawn move here, which is a pawn break, and this pawn move here, which is a pawn break. And all of these moves make a lot of sense potentially, right? Because you're creating threats. You're creating threats with those pawn breaks. Now, having said that, if you play the move e5, that one would tempt me the least, because when you go e5, if it was your move again, I'm not quite sure that you have such a big threat with it, right? I mean, maybe you could take on d4, but they could just take you back. It's not the end of the world. It might be a little bit in your favor, but nothing special. F4, on the other hand, at least you create immediate threat to win a pawn. So F4 is the move that I would give the most seriousness to. So far, I've got two moves that I've treated seriously. Number one, f4, and number two, or rather, number one, rook takes pawn on c3. That's a free pawn, so we should look at that first. And number two, f4. But before this, we should also think about threats. So what's a common mistake? Well, the student of mine in this position here, he actually went for the move rook takes c3. He ended up losing this game. But the problem was he didn't look at the position for threats. Now, what is the biggest threat that we can create? Do we have one move that black can play that creates a huge threat on the next move? Yes, so, and a lot of people were already saying in the chat, sorry guys that I was not giving you credit when credit was due, bishop c6. And the reason is, how you find this move is you spot the fact that what a lot of people in the chat spotted, so kudos to you guys, the queen on h5 has no squares. And you, when you're thinking in terms of threats, you think, well, can I create a threat against the king? That'll end the game. Can I create a threat against the next highest value piece, the queen? Wait a second, that queen is stuck. So now you start to think about ideas like bishop c6 to e8 or e5 to bishop f7. And so I really like that this example from this perspective, because after bishop c6, it's quite a straightforward move, and there isn't really much that white can do. You're threatening bishop e8, that'll win the full queen, and if white goes, for example, the move h4, that would be maybe the best shot at first glance. You just drop the bishop back to f6, and now you're threatening bishop e8. On top of that, now it's really bad for white, because if he goes f4 to try and give himself a little bit of run, a bit of a escape diagonal, the problem is you're getting checkmated here on g2. So in fact, in this position, what white would have to do is he'd have to go f4. And now in this position, black is really in great shape. He can move his bishop. And just as a little test, what would be the first move you'd consider in this position when it comes to moving your bishop on g5? Where would you think to take it? Right, so Tweedledee and Eddie say bishop h4. Sombrero and Nightmare says bishop takes f4. And one person I think may have said bishop e7. For me, it's very close between bishop takes f4 and bishop h4. Those are the two moves, but in principle, generally, we look at the capture first. That's a pawn. Of course, it's almost as attractive to threaten to win an exchange, which is worth it, twice as much as winning a pawn. So those are the two moves to look at first. But a common mistake would be to, play the move bishop f6 or bishop e7 without considering those options. Now, there's another reason why rook takes c3 was not a very good idea in this position. Can anybody tell me what the best move is for white here? So a couple of people are saying rook c1. Somebody is saying queen e8 check. And a couple of people are saying e4. So can I just say, excellent that those are the suggestions. So when we're thinking about our opponent's possibilities, if we're black here, we have to use the same system. So checks and captures, checks, captures, threats, right? So when I say checks and captures, for anybody who just arrived, what I mean by that is look for a move that is both a check and a capture as the top move. That's the most forcing, most likely to be best. Then just look at checks, then at captures, then at threats, and as well as threats, look at pawn breaks. And only once you've done all of that do you move to like slow moves. So for example, if everybody in the chat here said to me, without considering anything else, said to me king h1, I might actually just, you know, shut down the stream right now and be like, okay, okay, I need to work on what I'm on this material, because that would be not what I'm preaching at all, right? King h1, such a slow move. Instead, we look at the most sort of forcing moves first, starting with that check, queen e8. And what we realize is that after queen e8, we might, let's say, calculate this, and we might realize, well, king h7, we look at more checks, and then we say, well, bishop blocks, there are no more checks, what have we actually achieved? It turns out black's bishop is better on h6 and the king is on h7. Black's coordination or piece harmony has gotten better, so we sort of rule this variation out. But then we think about the other possibilities. Rook c1 creates a threat. So there are no captures in this position. The only capture in the position is to take the bishop on g5, but you don't want to lose your queen for a bishop. So rook c1. And then you reject that because you realize bishop takes e3. For black, now we should look at checks first. Bishop takes e3 is a check and a capture, and it'll be followed up by another capture. So that's game over right there. So we don't want rook c1 either. And then we see what are our possible threats or pawn breaks. And here we have the threat and the pawn break, e4. And that turns out to actually be a really nasty move for black to deal with. That's how the game went. The problem with e4 is that now one of these two files are going to open up. And this is very, very dangerous. On top of that, you have to be very careful. So you have to be careful in two ways. Number one, his position has improved. Remember what we were saying about positional improvement. And another thing that I want to sort of take you guys back to, if you'll bear with me, is here when I say stability is your friend. This first point here, stability is your friend. Undefended or loosely defended points in your position can and will be used against you. So if we go back to this position, what we notice is if we play the move like bishop c6 here, bishop c6, we would just be looking to drive that bishop to e8 and look at overall the stability of our position. So our rook would be sheltered in our position, not so vulnerable. e4 would not come with an attack against the bishop, so they wouldn't get any tempi trying to open up files for the rooks. And on top of that, of course, they'd have to react to the problem of his queen being threatened. So our position would be quite stable. But in this other situation that we went for rook takes c3, now our rook is in his half of the board and it's undefended. And when he plays the move e4, suddenly our bishop has to respond. And so now there are a lot of problems there. In fact, the opponent, the student, who is about a 2000 online rating, in this position, he saw the check, and so he went for the check, and he lost all of his advantage, because what did white play, guys? What is the strong move here for white? Rook takes e3. Correct, guys. Sombrero, Shackleton, absolutely correct. And that's the natural move to consider for white. Of course, I mean it's a check, and so you meet it with like white is in check. He doesn't have any checks of his own, but he does have a capture, and that's the first move to consider. And well, the variation is quite straightforward. You win two bishops for the rook, and that's a good deal for you. So for me, this game was eventually lost by the student because he did not take into account threats in the position. He stopped just at captures, And of course, when you're considering, had he considered a capture of a single pawn versus a threat to win a queen, I'm sure he would have spent time on that and worked it out, because the calculations themselves were not tricky. It's about spotting the right moves, making the right decisions. Okay, so that is this particular position. And I wanted to take you, let me see, because I wrote down the move order that I wanted to take you guys through the puzzles on. So now number 4 is here. All right. So you've got this position as black. And the first thing to look at is you've got equal materials, 6 pawns each. But there's a juicy pawn here that you could capture on d5. So my question to you is this. Would you A, capture it with the knight, B, capture it with the bishop, or C, not capture it at all? Maybe play some other move like bishop d6 or rook e8, something like that. So once again, I'll give you guys a minute, and then we'll talk through it. Or D, phone a friend. Mighty Chef, you gotta be careful when you make such comments in this computer era. There's a lot of people playing tournaments phoning a friend. Well, or rather, their phone is their friend. But it's good to see you, Mighty Chef. So a lot of people are saying not capture. A lot of people are saying bishop d6. Okay. Knight g4, Maripant suggests. Very logical. Okay, so a lot of the people who are saying do not capture the pawn, can anybody tell me why they don't want to capture it? Like, can anybody sort of write something in the chat defending their reasons for not being selfish? We all know in chess, selfishness is a very desirable trait. If you see the top guys, not selfishness, excuse me, greediness, greed. If you see the top guys, they're very greedy on the chessboard. They might be the nicest people in the world off the chessboard and the most generous, but they're greedy on the board. If they can capture something, they do it. Okay. So Ashtesh Yoshi and Piyush, they both say because of bishop to c4 that you wouldn't capture knight takes d5. Very good. So you don't want to take this way because of bishop c4. But in that case, why can't I just take with the bishop and prevent bishop c4? So any good reason to not take with the bishop? Screw says bishop takes f6. So he says if I take here, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6. And then it's okay. The knight is defending the bishop. At least for now, black is surviving. Okay, so can anybody suggest any problems with capturing the pawn with bishop takes d5? I think a lot of people, they've correctly psychoanalyzed me, and they sense that capturing the pawn is a bad idea. But we need proof. Okay, Court Hassie on YouTube and The Prophet and Dr. Shackleton on Twitch, they're suggesting knight f5. Knight f5 is problematic. Bishop takes, knight f5, hitting this bishop. And then you would maybe move the bishop, or maybe put the rook here. So there's a lot of possibilities here, and the calculation is not so simple. And I'll tell you why the calculation is not so simple, because you start off with two possibilities. One is to take with the knight and another to take with the bishop. That's very simple for black. But when you're looking at it from the white perspective, when you're trying to find, as black, what can white do? White has a bunch of different options. He can throw his knight onto f5. He can put his bishop on c4 or on b5. And none of his moves are actually the most forcing, which would be checks or captures, except bishop takes g7. So that one should also be considered. But overall, it's quite messy. And then if you look at bishop takes d5, that might be even messier, because there the capture doesn't seem to be very good. And the most scary move is actually knight f5, but that's a threat. That's not a check, not a check and capture, not a check, not a capture. It's a threat. And even after that threat, it looks like you can stop it. You can play a lot of different options, and there is no capture for white. So again, you need to look for threats from white, and you need to calculate them. For example, is bishop b5 a problem? Things like that. So that's where the calculation, or is knight d6, that's where calculation really gets problematic. You need a lot of visualization because your techniques are not going to be quite as helpful. So there's another tip here that can help you. Let's go back to that slide. If we go back to the slide, we can see this point once again. Stability is your friend. And on top of that, the second one, if your opponent has better placed pieces, generally don't open up the position. And these two things would make you very suspicious about taking the pawn. And so what you would want to do in a chess game is spend a long time on this position. This is what we call a critical moment. Maybe spend 15 minutes. If you're right, you're going to win a central pawn and you have a winning position. But if you're wrong and you miss something, you could be dead on the spot. So let's see now what black actually missed here. What black would miss if he takes the pawn. So the first thing is taking with the knight. A few players found the right solution. Bishop c4 turns out to be a really nasty move. We look at the checks, we look at the captures. Maybe the most interesting capture is this one, because after king takes, we can follow up immediately with a check. But we can do our calculation here, and we realize after king f6, there isn't anything here. White is down a piece. So we solve that. And then we look at captures. Maybe we look at this capture, but we realize that's just black is gifted in exchange. We'd be very happy with that. So we look at threats. Bishop c4 creates a threat against the knight. Bishop b5 creates another threat against the knight. What makes bishop c4 most attractive are the positional elements. The king is being x-rayed, and the other thing is the pieces here for black. There's a lot of either undefended or badly defended pieces. They're all stacked up on the same rank, the second rank. And so what white really wants, what an experienced player knows when he sees a bunch of minor pieces stacked up on a second rank and x-rayed, he says, I want to get my rook onto that rank, and I'm just going to devastate the position, hit the bishop, hit this bishop, hit the pawn. It's going to be horrific. So after bishop c4, it turns out it's game over because if you go knight takes c3, there's a beautiful intermezzo here, rook takes d7. And that takes us back to that point about stability. The problem with the black position is he's got so many undefended pieces, and there's too much instability. He can get rid of one by going bishop takes f3, but it's still one piece too many that are unstable. Here both pieces are undefended and attacked. and so game over. After knight, that's if knight takes d5, bishop c4. If, on the other hand, let's say black goes knight f6, now we could move in with the knight, hitting this bishop, and let's say that black moves his bishop. Well, now we can see once again the instability in the position. We've got this knight, it's attacked twice, and it's only defended twice. We've got this pawn, it's attacked once, and it's only defended once. And on top of that, we've got an X-ray here. So all of this is problematic. The other thing, the position is super open, and who has the better placed pieces? Clearly white. Why does white have the better placed pieces? Knight on f3, knight on f5, bishop on c3, bishop on c4. Everything is very central and very active. Whereas black has this knight in the line of fire and this bishop on the back rank. So we don't want these things. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I just looked at the chat. Oh no. Oh goodness. Oh goodness. I got carried away, guys. I got so carried away with the analysis. I'm so sorry, guys. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, guys. See, the thing about it is, you guys got just a beautiful opportunity to work on your visualization for the last 10 minutes, right? And I got a beautiful opportunity to manage public embarrassment. So we're both learning here. Sorry, guys, for that. So yeah, well, maybe I should start again. So I think I had started the explanation here. I'll run through it a little bit more quickly now that you guys can see the board. And let me actually place the OBS screen so that I don't make this mistake again on the same monitor. So in this position, what I was saying is that black has the option of capturing either knight takes d5 or bishop takes d5, but as we saw in this slide, and as you guys got to see on the slide for a bit longer than I had intended, you don't want to open up the position when you're worse coordinated, and you also want to watch out for your stability. If you have an unstable position, you can get into trouble very, very quickly, very, very quickly indeed. So in this position, if we go knight takes d5, look at the instability of the position. This knight has one attacker and only one defender. This knight has no defenders. The bishop has no defenders. This bishop on e7 only has the same defender that is a very weakly defended piece. So this entire configuration, this knight, all the minor pieces for black, they're in trouble. Look at the white ones, on the other hand. The white ones are defended, 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 defended. So black grabs a pawn, but he has to be really careful. And an additional detail is that this pawn here on g7 is what we call loose. Attacked once, defended only once. So that's what I mean by using sometimes not your calculation. And in the bootcamp, I talk about this, which is sometimes you can make decisions more on intuition than on pure calculation. So some players can be stronger than others just because they calculate similarly in terms of this brute force calculation and brute visualization, but they have like a better feeling for danger because they have like a better strategic understanding. So they don't want to take these pawns, they see the trap, let's say, or they smell the danger early on. And in this case, bishop c4 would be, as a few people commented, would be a beautiful move here, hitting all of these pieces. And the point is, when you take the bishop, now a beautiful intermezzo, a capture. A typical mistake would be to just capture this knight and think no more about that, but all our candidate moves should be considered. This capture should absolutely be considered, and now we see some problems. There are too many pieces in the line of fire here for black. 3 pieces, that's again the instability point. Black could continue his calculation and say, I'll get rid of one of my undefended pieces, but that's one too little. And in the end, black will lose one of his pieces and with it, the game. That's if knight takes d5. If bishop takes d5, now we actually see this point. Remember that we talked about in the last line just a second ago, the g7 pawn was a bit vulnerable. Now we see it in danger here. So knight f5 would come in, hit our bishop, and where do we go with our bishop? The most normal move would be, for example, rook e8. But now, can people in the chat tell me what is what's a strong move here, or what would you play here? Okay, so I tried to catch you guys out by talking about the g7 pawn and sort of setting you up, but I like the fact a lot of people are not being thrown off the scent, and they very, very correctly point out the best move, which is bishop to b5 in this position. So that's really an important trait, by the way. Don't ever let yourself, if you want to get as good as possible at chess, you gotta be stubborn. And don't let others' opinions influence you too much. Make your own judgments at all times. Having said that, for those who said knight takes g7, that's also a pretty good move. But the strongest move in the position is bishop b5. And again, how would we make sure to avoid this? Well, common mistake, if I'm seeing a student's game, here's what's going to happen. A student will say, I played knight takes g7 here. And I'll say, okay, and knight takes g7, what was your idea? So, well, I calculated bishop takes f3 and king takes g7. And I figured that if they take on g7, I would take here and I'd have a great position, and this is correct. And then I thought about the position, and I thought, if I take here, if they take me here, I'll take here. And then if they take my knight, I'll take here. That's a beautiful bit of calculation, and it's absolutely correct, and white is absolutely a bit better. But on the other hand, material is equal, and after a move like king f8, black actually more or less manages to survive. At least for now. White can press, but black stays in the game. The mistake isn't the calculation of the variation. The mistake is the candidate moves in this position. After bishop takes d5, knight f5, and rook e8, we have to take a step back before we play this move. I don't know if you guys have heard this thing people say, when you find a good move, find one better, right? Some old master said something along these lines, and it's kind of been popular since then. But here it's really about looking at your checks. You have this one and your checks and captures, looking at your captures, but also looking at your pawn breaks and your threats. You don't have any good pawn break, so you look at the threat here, bishop b5. And it turns out bishop b5 is really, really strong. Sorry, I keep making this mistake. Because bishop b5 undermines the stability of the black position. This knight is already under fire. The bishop is under fire. So it's hard to draw. So many pieces are under fire. So the rook is tied down to defending a loose bishop. Attackers 1, defenders 1. The knight is tied down to defending another loose bishop. Attackers 1, defenders 1. The same knight is tied down to defending the knight on d7. So it's overloaded. The whole position is a disaster. So black, in order to solve his problems, needs to try and find some kind of stabilizing move. And his best bet is bishop e6. get the bishop out of the way, attack a piece, and reinforce this knight. But now, white to play, what is his best move? So people are saying bishop takes knight. And let it to be says knight takes g7 now. Yeah, knight takes g7 now is slightly stronger. Well, if you play bishop takes b7, if you play bishop takes b7 here, then the point is black can actually take you here, and after knight takes g7 now, if black takes your knight, you take his bishop, so that's a great deal for you, but black can actually play rook to d8. And the point is, this knight is a little bit stuck because the squares are locked off. So one of the important things when you're calculating variations and you have a better position is look for the simplest path. In this case, the simplest way is to take with the knight on g7 immediately, because now if, let's say, he moves the rook, then you can just take his bishop. So your knight doesn't get stuck. That's a very simple variation. And if on the other hand you take his knight, he takes your knight, then you take here. So you get a very similar position, but without the problem of the knight. That's actually not something that I came today to discuss, but this has to do with like cycling back and forth between similar options and just like some practical decision-making tips. I'll go into a bit of that in the bootcamp, but well, for today it was supposed to be, the lesson is supposed to be ending very, very soon in a few minutes. So that's not something to dive into too much detail, unfortunately, today. But it's very important about risk reward and not overcomplicating things for yourself. Okay, so this, it turns out, by the way, I just want to address one last question. People had said, why can you not just drop your bishop back? I believe this was one of the questions. And the answer there is, it's once again the same idea. You take on g7, and after takes here, you can take this bishop on d5. And of course, black can play bishop takes f3, but after g takes f3, we see it's the same idea. If you take this knight, the second you take it, the rook will take your knight. So some tricky calculation, but the moral of the story is that in this position, you need to be 100% sure that you can get away with taking the pawn, because you have a lot of unstable pieces. And if you take the pawn, you're going to open up lines. So notice if you take it with, for example, the knight, look at how you end up getting killed, right? So after taking the knight, you get rid of this pawn. And what you do by getting rid of that pawn is you open up these two diagonals. And you open up this file. And notice how the way in which you got sort of killed as black here was with the move bishop c4, which hits you on both the diagonals and the files. So usually when analyzing your games, take note of that kind of thing. Which, did you open up the position when you were worse coordinated? Did you get killed as a result? So that's worth looking at. Let's talk about one final position. One final position. And this is from the current Norway chess event. And it was a position, it was a game between Duda, the Polish Grandmaster Duda, and the luckless Arian Tari, who's been having a tough event. Of course, he is the lowest rated player in the event, but he here had a little bit of an unfortunate game. we can actually show it from Duda's side, who had the white pieces. Where is the flip board? Okay, perfect. So started off with a Ruy Lopez, and then it soon got very, very crazy with this f5 here on move 4. And then we get this position, and black went for knight a5. And now there's a point here. White took the pawn, and black played c5. So black has two threats: to capture the knight and to push here and trap the bishop on b3. Now, some of you may have seen this game, but mainly let's try and get answers from those who haven't. So my question to you is this: what would you do here? What would you do as white? What variations would you calculate as white in order to solve your problems? And this will be the final position of the session. If you've enjoyed this session, well, two things, I guess. Please feel free to give it a like. Always appreciated. And the other thing is, well, the platform that I'm a coach on is coachchess.com, and this is part of the bootcamp previews series. Basically, bootcamps are group up to 10 people in my bootcamp can join, and it's like fairly intensive. It's 10 hours of work over the course of 2 weeks on a particular theme, in this case on calculation and decision making. So it's very interactive. People will be able to sort of show their games, discuss positions in group, etc. And the idea is just to sort of to really drill down on these big points that are, in my opinion, very difficult to learn just from a book. Calculation and decision making. There's so much going on, and there's such an interplay. So that's sort of the idea there. Feel free to check out coachchess.com for more info. Okay, so what are people saying? What are people saying as options here? People are saying bishop g8 is one line, knight f5, knight takes f5 is another line. Okay, so for those who saw the game, the move knight takes f4 and knight takes f5 was actually played by Duda after quite a long think, I believe. But he did take this pawn. But after taking the pawn, black was able to win the piece. So what did Duda calculate that made him go for this instead of going for bishop takes g8, bishop takes g8, and then black could play maybe c takes d4, and then white drops the bishop back? That seems like an interesting line to calculate. It's equal material. Whereas if you take here, what did he calculate to take here and to then be down a piece? Can anybody take a guess as to what he might have calculated? Yeah, because Piyush is saying, what about the trapped bishop? Absolutely. What about the trapped bishop? NSU says if he now has a danger check. A lot of people are now saying knight d6. Knight d6. Maripan saying knight takes g7. Excellent. This is the way that calculation should work. You guys are looking at the checks. But the thing about it is, I've tricked you. I've tricked you because I've asked a question that's a bit of a trick question. And the reason is because this position here shouldn't be solved through calculation, at least not calculation alone. This one, after bishop takes g8, pawn takes d4, bishop goes to b3, is a position that Duda was very easily able to calculate. For example, he might have seen something like this, and then might have said black can go bishop c5, and he might have stopped his calculation here. He might have figured, well, black has the bishop pair, okay center, I have a little bit lag in development, material is equal, in fact material is equal, so this position doesn't look that great for me, let me stop here. But when it comes to knight takes f5, calculation is just not going to cut it. After c4, there's just nothing direct. Why there is nothing direct? Well, knight takes g7 doesn't work. It turns out that knight d6 check is just not such a strong move. After knight d6, black can go takes, and black can actually just develop his pieces and the bishop remains trapped. So it turns out this is maybe not such a strong way of playing. So you don't have checks, you don't have captures, you don't have threats. So what do you have? Well, the one thing that you have is you've got a lead in development and you've got bad pieces for black. The knight on a5 is a bad piece, and you've also got huge control over squares because of this beautiful pawn structure. You've got a monster knight on f5, and you've got a lead in development that you can combine with threats along the e file. What chess players would call this is you have permanent advantages or a long-term initiative. And so it's not about solving through calculation because the position is too complicated and it's not accessible to calculation efforts. Instead, it's about analyzing enough positions over the years and building up your intuition and making an intuitive judgment. Do you go for it? Do you say, yeah, I believe in this? It's almost a question of faith. I believe in it, or do you not go for it? And that's actually a topic we'll touch upon, when to understand when it should be calculation versus when it should be intuition. And the last thing I want to leave you on this example and on the day is with Vladimir Kramnik, former world champion's thoughts. I wrote them down from the actual stream. He was commentating with Judith Polgar, and this is what he had to say. He said, "This is not a calculation decision. It's more a question of hesitating or not. Experienced players will go for it quickly if they decide to do it. It's a conceptual decision. Because of course you understand that it's very dangerous, but it's also very interesting and you feel it must be good. So really it's more about your feeling. The question becomes, am I ready to sacrifice a piece and play against a strong opponent a piece down, but with the initiative? Or do I want to play safer? Because to calculate out everything here is impossible. So it's really more about your feeling." And to end this, Judith latches onto that and she asks Kramnik, and I like I hope you enjoyed, by the way, that was Kramnik's thoughts on this specific decision. And then I want to read out one more paragraph to you guys. Judith then says to Kramnik, okay, so she thought it was a very interesting line of conversation. And she said, Kramnik, how much do you think you, in your day, when you were playing, he retired very recently, how much do you think you were an intuitive player and how much of chess was calculation for you? And he said, I think it's always the same. There is no such thing as pure intuition. Actually, intuition is telling you when to calculate and when not. So even calculation is intuition in a way, because there are always lots of variations to calculate. So the best is to rely on your intuition to understand when you have to calculate versus when it's so complicated that you just have to make a decision by feel. So it's very difficult to separate these two things. You know very well, Judith, every move you make is a mixture of these two. So I thought that was a very, very interesting conversation. I wanted to throw that into the lesson of today. I hope you guys have enjoyed this session on calculation and decision making, and do check out coachess.com. The link is there as well if you're thinking to maybe join the camp. There'll be a total of 10 seats. Yeah, hopefully that's going to be it from me. I know that they're back in action in Norway very soon, so I'm gonna leave it at that. But I hope that you guys enjoyed the lesson and you got something out of it. I will answer the question from Aleph now. Curious to know what the engine recommended. It recommended knight takes f5. So it was the correct decision. And by the way, just to not leave you guys hanging, this game ended very, very badly for Arian Tari. You see the monstrous coordination of the pieces from white, and eventually this did happen, and black was actually so busy fighting off problems, he didn't even take the piece for free here. For example, had he taken like this, the problem was queen takes g7, so he didn't even take the piece for free. And by the time knight f6 happened, he went queen c3, and now were you to move the knight back, the problem is rook e1. So the position was actually so horrible for black that he didn't even in the end manage to collect the piece that he had set out to collect in the beginning with his earlier decision of pawn to c5. Okay, so thank you guys for everybody who tuned in. Really appreciate it, and yeah, glad that some of you guys or hope most of you guys enjoyed it. Do give it a like if you did, and see you guys again in the near future, whether it's for this or for some other topic. So have a great day, and catch you all soon.